Slavery went through what I've always thought three different stages. You had the forming of the US Constitution in 1789, and in there, in the Constitution, international slave trade ended in 1808. So from 1789 to 1808, there wasn't a lot of really talk about publicity. It wasn't public. They thought it was going to get done with, over with by 1808. In fact, the northern states, Pennsylvania passed a law in about 1780 for gradual emancipation. Massachusetts in 1780, 1781 had two Supreme Court cases that got rid of, just banned slavery. A little bit later, I think it was the state of Vermont in the Constitution, banned slavery. So all this was happening in the North, but really not a whole lot was happening in the South. So between 1789 and 1808, not much was happening. Then after 1808, you ended up with slavery being called, particularly from the Southerners, how did they phrase it? A necessary evil was the term of art. They didn't know how to get rid of it because it had been around so long. Well, while the northern states were getting rid of it, the southern states weren't really doing much of anything. It's true that in about 1830, 1833, Thomas Jefferson did try to get rid of slavery in Virginia, but the legislature voted it down. Jefferson was not much of a person for confrontation, and so it died in Virginia, that initial push. How strong that push was, probably not very strong, but there was what they could say, we attempted to do something. Well, that necessary evil, then all of a sudden in about 1830 became a positive good. Look how much better off these slaves are. Look how much better off their life is as compared to what it was in Africa. Well, you can justify anything, and that's what the Southerners did. In about the 1830s is when slavery, that is the abolition of slavery, became more public. Now, it was around since George Washington at Valley Forge. In fact, Washington, there's a letter or two Washington wrote complaining about the Quakers removing his slaves from him and taking them elsewhere. But other than the Quakers, it really wasn't overly organized. It wasn't publicly pushed, advertised. It was kept quiet. In the 1830s, however, when it became a positive good, things changed. People got more upset, particularly the Northerners. And the North particularly got upset because slaves in the South, you had the 3/5 compromise in the Congress. And the South was getting more representation in Congress than they deserved. And as a result, the South was controlling Congress. In fact, if you look at it, go through our first 6 presidents. 2 of them didn't have, the Adamses did not have slavery, the others did. If you keep going to the 7th president, you had Andrew Jackson. He was a slave owner. Then you had Martin Van Buren, who was a Northerner, but was very Jacksonian, if you would. And yeah, that was fine with him. So the first dozen or so presidents, you maybe had 2 non-slaveholders. So they controlled the presidency. And then when you went to Congress, you had, starting in 1815, you had Henry Clay, from the great compromiser from Kentucky, who was Speaker of the House, eventually went to the Senate. But once the Southerners were in Congress, whether the House of Representatives or the Senate, they seemed to stay. And since the House and Senate were geared towards seniority as far as chairmanships, The Southerners controlled Congress that way. And they continued to do that as long as slaves were counted as 3/5 of a person, because they got more votes that way. So in the 1830s, we started to hear more about abolition publicly. It existed for 30, 40 years before that, 50 years before that, but it became public. And in April of 1835, April 22nd, 23rd, and 24th, the Ohio Anti-Slavery Society, the state society, was founded in Putnam at the Stone Academy. The Stone Academy is one of our 2 museums that we still operate. The original building still stands, built in 1809, and there is where 114 men from throughout the state of Ohio and outside the state met to form the Ohio Anti-Slavery Society. Now, how did that get started? Why did they choose Putnam? Well, you got to take a step back. Zanesville was formed back in 1796, 1797. There was a man by the name of Ebenezer Zane who constructed, hacked out the Zanes Trace. Now, the Zanes Trace, the best description I could find of the trace that Ebenezer Zane, his brother Jonathan, his son-in-law John McIntyre, and about 5 other gentlemen hacked out. It was wide enough for a fat horse to get through single file. The trace, they could leave stumps, about 12 inches high, and you had overhanging branches. So if you were walking and looking down at the ground, you may look up and get whacked in the face by a branch. Or if you were looking at a branch, you may break your foot on a stump. But that became the overland route because there was no roads through Ohio whatsoever. The principal means of transportation was the Ohio River. The Ohio River, however, froze in the winter and flooded in the spring. So it wasn't overly reliable for, let's say, 6 months out of the year. And that was how mail was transported as well as other goods. So Ebenezer Zane convinced Congress to give him a grant, permission to build this trace from Wheeling, Virginia, to Zanesville, to Lancaster, to Chillicothe, down to Limestone, Kentucky, which is now today Maysville, Kentucky. Sort of like, I guess, closest shape would be like a sickle shape type of thing. But in any event, then Ebenezer Zane sold for $100 to his son-in-law, John McIntyre, and his brother, Jonathan Zane, sold $100 as a thank you for helping him cut this trace, the place where Zanesville is located. Now, Zanesville, on the east side, if you've ever been over the Y Bridge to Zanesville, you know, it goes in the middle and you can make a left turn and a right turn. Well, on the east side, that was Zanesville. On the south side, you eventually had Putnam, and then there's the Putnam Hill Park. And then on the other side of Putnam Hill Park was an unincorporated village called Natchez. Then on the west side of the bridge, you had West Zanesville. West Zanesville was a separate entity. It had its own government and everything, so you had 4 different villages around that confluence where the Licking River and the Muskingum River come together. So we had, when the trace was cut, it really started in Maryland. You had the Cumberland Road, but Maryland, Virginia, and Kentucky were connected. So on the Zanesville side, starting in 1800, 1799, you had people from those 3 southern states landing in Zanesville. In 1801, Increase Matthews ended up down in Marietta, as did John McIntyre, at a land auction. John McIntyre bid $4 an acre. Increase Matthews bid $4.25 an acre. Increase Matthews and his partner Levi Whipple bought Putnam. So $4.25 an acre. And in 1801, because Levi Whipple and Increase Matthews were from the New England states, and if you've read David McCullough's book, The Pioneers, they were from New England. And people from Marietta then moved up the Muskingum River and ended up settling in Putnam. So you had New England anti-slavery people on one side of the river, and you had pro-slavery or don't rock the boat people on the Zanesville side of the river. And they didn't get along very well. In fact, Zanesville's first run-in with slavery occurred in 1814 when a black man who was accused of being a runaway slave was brought into Zanesville by two white men. They wanted to house him in the local jail at the time, and the abolitionists did not want that, heard about it, didn't like that. The anti-abolitionists heard about it, they didn't mind it. So there was sort of a nonviolent standoff. The black man who's being accused of a runaway didn't like being housed in the jail. So, and I can't say that I blame him, so he came up with an idea of burning a hole in the jail to escape. Now, how he was going to do this, we don't know. What he had to do it with, we don't know. But in any event, he was successful. He did burn a hole in the jail. In fact, he burnt the whole damn jail down. And the jail was destroyed, and he got out. Fortunately, he got to the abolitionist side, or the abolitionist group, who escorted him out of town. What this man's name was, where he came from, where he went to, we don't know, but Zanesville had to build a new jail. Fortunately, it was raining that night, and the rain helped suppress the fire. We know that from a newspaper article I was able to find from an 1814 newspaper that told about the event. Fortunately, our Times Recorder gave us all their inventory of papers, which is on microfilm or microfiche. Yes, they still do have that. And it is very, I don't recommend reading it. The columns in the newspapers generally were about that wide, about that big a print, about 6 columns on a page. And reading glasses, you might want to have a magnifying glass in addition to your reading glasses, because after a while the print also melts together because of the type of type it was. So whether you're looking at an E or an O, you have to guess by reading ahead of the word and back of the word and ahead of the word, and then, well, this is probably what it is to make sense. So that was the first run-in that Zanesville had in 1814. Then pretty much both sides were, not much happened. In 1834, however, a gentleman by the name of Theodore Weld, that's a name you may or may not have heard of, W-E-L-D. He doesn't get the credit that he deserves for his anti-slavery positions. Theodore Weld was a magnificent, according to everything that I've read, since I didn't know the man, everything I read, he was an outstanding orator. He was hired by the American Anti-Slavery Society, which was founded in 1834. And he was to go throughout the state of Ohio and lecture, give abolitionist speeches. He started out in Ripley, Ohio. He went to Circleville, went to Chillicothe, went to Steubenville, went to Marietta, went to northern Ohio, over to Oberlin, and he was in Zanesville on a couple of occasions. When this man gave his speeches, anti-slavery speeches, he didn't speak for an hour. He would speak for 2 and 3 hours at a time. And he may stay in an area, I think in Circleville, I think he stayed about 6 days giving these speeches that length every day. And then the local community may may have a person who disagreed with his position, and then they would have a debate back and forth. So he was out there and spoke all over the state, and then eventually came to Zanesville at the end of February, like February 28th of 1835. And the only place that was open to him to speak was the Stone Academy. Now, since 1838, the Stone Academy has been a private residence. But in 1835, when it was built back in 1809, it was built for school purposes, hence the name Academy, public meetings, religious services, just a general all-purpose building for meetings. And so that's what it was. There were 2 rooms downstairs and 1 room upstairs. So if you do visit, you'll have to use your imagination because that isn't what it is anymore, inside at least. But in any event, he spoke there in the beginning in March, gave his anti-slavery speeches for about 2 weeks, and people from Zanesville crossed the river and disrupted the meeting. They would throw rocks at the windows, breaking windows at the Stone Academy, busted down the door, broke the gate that was out front of the Stone Academy at the time, but just a mini riot, if you would. It was fended off, but these anti-slavery speeches went on. He left the Zanesville and then came back at the end of April for the convention. But in any event, knowing that the disruption would occur again, or probably occur again, which it did, the Zanesville people tried to get the help from the prosecutor to have guards, if you would. That proved fruitless. So between April 1822, 23, and 24, there was the convention. And as I said, 114 people from throughout the state. Now only 1 black man attended that convention. The reason being, as Theodore Weld wrote in 1835, he did talk to the black leaders and tried to get them to come, tried to get them to attend and voice their opposition to slavery, but they wouldn't. They were scared because if they did attend, they were fearful that they would be fired and that they would be beaten and generally harassed. And in fact, the 1 man who did attend was pushed down and roughed up going across the bridge, according to Weld. But the convention went on, and the State Society was formed. Now, Weld also had formed many, many, many local anti-slavery societies in Circleville, in Chillicothe, in Ripley, Ohio. So that was his function, to form these societies, but he did successfully complete and form the State Anti-Slavery Society. After 1835, he did move on to New York to do the same thing. But what happened to Weld, he spoke so much and for so long that he literally lost his voice. He couldn't do it anymore. And in fact, if you're familiar with the Grimke sisters, Theodore Weld was, I always get this wrong, I got a 50-50 chance of being right, Sarah Grimke's husband. So they were married. But in any event, Weld tried to give speeches just prior to the Civil War, anti-slavery speeches, doing the same thing that he did back in 1835 in the state of Ohio. He couldn't do it. His voice just wouldn't do it. So he and his wife ended up teachers over on the East Coast. But Weld, he just lost his voice as a result of what he did in 1835. There was again violence in 1835. People from Zanesville came over, disrupted the meeting, but Putnam, which was your abolitionist area for the most part, they took the meeting to private homes. For example, probably the most prominent abolitionist in Putnam that does not get enough credit is a man by the name of A.A. Guthrie. And he had several brothers, a Stephen Guthrie, a George Guthrie, Orestes Guthrie. How many times do you hear a child named Orestes today? And then you had Horace Nye, but you had a group of very active and very strong abolitionist people that supported the movement. Then you had the Putnam Presbyterian Church that was opened for business in February of 1835. And the first minister at the Putnam Presbyterian Church was a man by the name of William Beecher. Beecher probably is a name that sounds somewhat familiar. And yes, his sister was Harriet Beecher Stowe. And she would visit her brother, I think once or twice during the time, 3-year period he was a minister at the church. He married a local woman. And then in 1839, a man by the name of Addison Kingsbury became the minister. And from 1839 to 1877, Addison Kingsbury was the pastor at the Putnam Presbyterian Church. He wrote a history of the church in 1877. And I always like referring to his history because he talks about the Underground Railroad. He said he would be remiss if he didn't talk about the Underground Railroad because many of his parishioners, not all, but many of his parishioners were involved in the Underground Railroad. In fact, 2 of his 3 first elders of the church were very much involved in the Underground Railroad. One was A.A. Guthrie, 2 was Levi Whipple, and a third, I can't remember the man. He was the oldest of the 3. But the church was used, and as he referred to it, the people who participated in the Underground Railroad movement and the movement itself was an irritant to him. And he uses the word irritant in his history because you have to realize, being the minister, while most of the church was probably abolitionist oriented, you had a minority in the church, or a substantial minority perhaps, that was not abolitionist. So he was the middleman. He had to satisfy both sides. But at the same time, Levi Whipple gave the land that the church was built on. A.A. Guthrie was sort of the project manager of the church as it was being built. A.A. Guthrie became one of the 3 elders of the church. So the abolitionists were pretty well entrenched in that church, and they took charge. In 1835, the convention was held, and they petitioned Congress. And most of the time, now in about 1833, U.S. Congress passed a rule called the gag order, that they couldn't send anti-slavery petitions to Congress. Well, they could send them, but they wouldn't be addressed in Congress. If you are familiar with the Constitution, the people have a right to petition their Congress for their grievances. And prior to this gag rule being passed, Congress was inundated with anti-slavery petitions. And the Southerners got so PO'd, along with the Northern Democrats, that they wouldn't address these petitions. They passed this gag order. And as a result, this gag order silenced everybody except John Adams, who was in Congress at that time. And if you ever get to read a biography on John Adams about his time in Congress, he was a hoot and a holler because he was very eloquent in his speech, and his ability to use the English language was just mesmerizing. And he ended up still introducing these bills, but using a story that wasn't slavery oriented, but after listening to it for a minute or 2, you knew it was slavery oriented, but he used other examples. He had a wonderful, wonderful way to sidestep that gag order. We've been able to find, that is Muskegon County history, I've been fortunate enough working with an archivist from the National Archives. We've been able to locate 7 anti-slavery petitions written from Putnam between 1834 and 1842 with the names of people from Putnam, from A.A. Guthrie to Increase Matthews, to the women that signed off on these petitions. The women were very much involved in writing petitions, and we had a strong, we had a female anti-slavery society, and Lucinda Nye, Horace Nye's wife, was the president of that society. Now, at the time, prior to 1839, men and women didn't meet together. That was not proper. The 1839 convention, when it came back to Putnam, was held at the Putnam Presbyterian Church, and men and women did meet. But all the petitions were for abolishing slavery in Washington, D.C., and that's what they attacked. They didn't attack necessarily slavery in the South, but they did not want the slave auctions, for example, in Washington, D.C., which was there were a lot of slave auctions there. And slavery wasn't abolished in Washington, D.C. until all the Southerners withdrew from Congress and only Northerners were there, and Lincoln was able to pass a law abolishing slavery in Washington, D.C. And that's what he did. And at the same time, Haiti, which had a revolution in the 1790s, where the black population overthrew the French rulers, was never recognized by the United States until about 1862, 1863, when no Southerners were in Congress. So that's when Haiti was recognized as a legitimate government, since the French were now gone. But a lot of things happened, but the anti-slavery movement continued through Ohio. 1835, it was in Putnam. 1836, it was in Granville. 1837, I think it was over in Mount Pleasant. 1838, back in Granville. 1839, it was back in Zanesville. 1840, it was in Massillon. I can't remember 1841, but in 1842, it was in Mount Vernon. And then it fell apart because it split. You had Horace Greeley on one side and the Tappan, T-A-P-P-A-N, brothers on the other side. The Tappan brothers and the people who followed their logic, their position, thought that working through the government, working through what existed now, going through channels was the way to get rid of this slavery. Horace Greeley wanted to ignore the Constitution, get rid of the Constitution, thought it was an evil document, and don't participate in politics. So those two sides eventually split. Also, Horace Greeley believed in women taking part in the process, and the Tappan brothers did not. So that was another split, and that was one reason why the women's movement and the black movement, the anti-slavery movement, the first civil rights movement, if you want, were together until the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments of the United States Constitution, when blacks, those three, were addressed to slavery, equal rights for black men, and the women weren't involved in that. So that coalition split apart at that time, much later. But the movement kept going. We have history of A.A. Guthrie and George Guthrie hiding runaway slaves in their house. And George Guthrie's wife tells in her autobiography that when the slave catchers would come down their street, and she knew they were slave catchers because they were on their white horse with their big hat, chewing their tobacco, and then when they spoke, their drawl gave them away. And as a result, they would ask, have you seen so-and-so? He's a runaway slave. She would direct them in one direction. They would go that direction. Then she would lead them out of the house in another direction and move them on, so they moved on north. The runaway slaves generally came up the Muskingum River, but there were numerous. Athens had numerous roads. From Cincinnati to Marietta, the Ohio network was probably the most used network on the Underground Railroad system. The numbers, dozens upon dozens of routes. The reason Ohio was so well used because, well, Virginia and Kentucky were on its southern border, and the object was to get to Canada, and from like Portsmouth or Gallipolis to Lake Erie, it's approximately 200 miles. So you had a straight line, and the runaway slaves would go up the Muskingum River, up the Hocking, and it was called Hocking at the time, H-O-C-H-O-C-K-I-N-G. So I'm not sure when they dropped one hawk, but they did. And then you had the Scioto River, and then also you had the big and little Miami rivers over around Cincinnati area. And the runaways would just follow the rivers north. They had very little help getting north because generally the conductors, people who moved the runaways from point A to point B, did not go south. The runaways had to make it to the northern line, and then the conductors and station masters would kick in. Now there were exceptions to the rule. John Parker over in the Cincinnati Ripley area, he had a man from Morgan County by the name of Cheadle who would go into Virginia and bring back runaways. Cheadle was somewhat of an ingenious man for what's written on him. When he went south delivering produce or whatever he would carry down, he would act a little perturbed, a little strange. So people stayed away from him because he was weird. And as a result, he used this weirdness to have runaways hide in his carriage, his wagon, and he would move them north. And then obviously probably one of the most famous is Harriet Tubman. But Harriet Tubman, she was over on the Maryland Eastern Shore, and the route she ran would have been Maryland up through New York and then over to Canada. So there was a long route that she would run, but she never was in Ohio. But like I said, you did have a few conductors who did go south, but not many. So the runaway slaves deserve a tremendous amount of credit for their bravery and perseverance to get north. Because if they were caught, the consequences would be substantial. In fact, probably the most substantial would be to be sold south. And what that was, selling south down to Louisiana and lower Mississippi on the bayou where they grew indigo and sugar and other crops that had to be grown in extremely hot, sticky weather. And although working in a cotton field was bad enough, if you're sold south, your life expectancy just went down another decade. No one wanted sold south because the work was that much more tough than just picking cotton. The 1808 cutoff did not affect the South at all, because what happened, we had states like Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, add a whole new, doubled the size of our continent, and also opened up more land for cotton and other crops. As a result, even though slaves, black people could not be brought in through the international slave trade, although only one captain was hung for violating that, and that was during the Civil War. He was caught and hung. the southern states on the east side, Virginia, Maryland, or Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, their property was getting depleted. They used to grow a lot of tobacco. But they found out that if a black man and black woman got together, they ended up producing a couple of children. Those children then, or the woman, was used as currency, and they were sold to Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi. So the sale of people was very much recognized, and that's how Virginia and South Carolina and North Carolina, they made money. So even though the international slave trade was cut off, or supposedly cut off, they still made money by the interior sale of slaves from the East Coast into the Deep South. The Underground Railroad movement eventually died off on its own with the Civil War. No longer did the runaway slaves have to go north. They could jump behind William Tecumseh's Sherman or U.S. Grant's army and follow the army, and they had protection by the army. No one would attack them because the army was there. So it eventually, and then it ended with the 13th Amendment. And if anybody's watched Lincoln, Doris Kearns Goodwin, that movie with Daniel Day-Lewis a number of years ago, the 13th Amendment then permanently ended slavery in the South, although the civil rights movement had to come back again in the 50s and 60s, which was unfortunate, but sometimes people just they didn't want to change, and change was necessary, and people like Dr. Martin Luther King made that change happen. So the Underground Railroad movement was a movement usually in the 30s and 40s and 50s. There were a lot of people that were involved in it. Zanesville, again, had a slave case in 1859 where a gentleman was tricked to come back from Belmont County, and he was then captured and brought before the court in May of 1859. And what happened, the judge let him loose. He said the slave catchers didn't prove that he was a slave, so they cut him loose. As he left the courthouse, he was arrested by the U.S. Marshal under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, jailed and brought back to court the next day. And the same judge who found him not to be a runaway slave, the next day found him to be a runaway slave. So he was then jailed, and the day after that second hearing, he was transported by train back south, and unfortunately, we don't know what happened to him after that. We know he was moved, but Zanesville had its share of the court action in 1814 and then again in 1859, which I wish we could. There was just not a lot of publication, not a lot of print on what happened to this gentleman. No one followed him, so that was unfortunate. But there's a very active Underground Railroad movement from the Putnam area to New Concord to Cambridge, and then moving north, because the whole idea was to get to Canada. That's all I have. You'll have a handout. You're more than welcome to go through that. I do have pictures of like the Horace Nye House and the Putnam Presbyterian Church and the Stone Academy, the George Guthrie House and the A.A. Guthrie House. We have A.A. Guthrie, George Guthrie, and Horace Nye. Their homes still stand today. They're private residence. They were built in the 1830s and 1840s. And we have the Increase Matthews House, which was built in 1805. And then the Putnam Presbyterian Church built in open for business in 1835. So, as well as the Stone Academy. So we do have a substantial history that still stands today involving the Underground Railroad, which we're pretty proud of. So thank you.